So look, I'm going to be straight up with you all. What you're looking at is my favorite integrated amplifier under $500. Let's talk about it. So here it is, the second generation of the Vista Audio Spark. I reviewed the original Spark integrated amplifier roughly 4 years ago, and I fondly recall my time with it. But now that it's been updated, it's time to go over what's changed with the Spark and to talk about how it stacks up to today's competition. So first, let me get this out of the way. In case you're not familiar with Vista Audio and the Spark, what you're looking at is a purist audiophile solution, meaning that this integrated amplifier is designed only with sound quality in mind. There's virtually no features with it, no remote control, no tone controls, no built-in DACs or phono stages or anything like that. Instead, this is all about quality over quantity. Now, what you're looking at is also a Class AB integrated amplifier that'll output 20 watts per channel into 8 ohms. And because it's a purist piece, there's not really a whole lot to go over, because on the front of it, we have this metal volume control. We have a switch that goes between our two analog inputs. And then over here, we have our power switch. So let's go ahead and flip this on, because one of the major changes to the Spark are cosmetic. Previous Spark was rather plain Jane, but now we have lights illuminating the top and the side front panel. The Spark logo now illuminates. We get lights around the volume control and a light in the center. Looks pretty cool. But that's all there is to the front, so now let's turn this off and take a look at the back. So I have to unplug it, flip it around, and there's the back. Not much to talk about. We have our terminals for our speakers. We have our two analog inputs and the IEC inlet for our power cord, and that is it. So now we're going to pop the hood and take a peek at what's underneath. All right, so I just popped the hood of the Spark II, so let's take a closer look. And I gotta say, this is a very clean looking integrated amp. So as a reminder, this is a Class AB design that'll output 20 watts per channel into 8 ohms. So now let's take a closer look at the components. Up front, we have this nice looking toroidal transformer. Next to that, we have our filter caps. And back here, we're going to have our transistor, singular, attached to these heat sinks. Actually, that's pretty adequate given the design of this amp. On the back, look at that. We have some Mondorf caps. Looks to be in the input section. That's pretty cool. We have our potentiometer. And overall, it's a very simple, good-looking design. Now, in case you're wondering what changes were brought to the Spark II, beyond cosmetics, they doubled the filter capacitance and they also changed the frequency response. So instead of it going from 10 hertz to 80 kilohertz as before, it'll now dig down to 5 hertz, which isn't a big deal, all the way up to 200 kilohertz, which, believe it or not, that is a big deal, because that allows the Spark II to produce a square wave at 20 kilohertz, which has a residual benefit down into the frequencies that you can hear. So that's pretty awesome. Another awesome thing is when I asked Vista Audio where they make this amplifier, they said not only is it designed and assembled in Serbia, but all the parts, both inside and outside of the Spark, supposed to be sourced from the US, Japan, and the EU. They really wanted to stay away from Chinese materials, which I know is something some of you can appreciate. But now it's time to talk about how it actually sounds. So look, when it comes to performance, the Spark II really exemplifies both the pros and the cons that go along with an affordable, purist audiophile solution. For example, on the upside, when you pair the Spark II up to the right speakers, you'll be treated to performance that is exceptional for the money. I'm talking about something that's on par with, if not even better than, many full-featured integrated amps that cost $1,000 or more. However, the downside is that, well, for one, this is a small integrated amplifier. It'll only output 20 watts per channel, and that makes it something of a niche solution. Something that's best for either desktop applications or in small rooms pushing relatively efficient speakers. Now, if that's you, then I think this is one of the best solutions out there for the money. But for everybody else, it's going to be an easy pass. Now, before I talk about the sound, there's one more topic I need to cover first, and that is to talk about how the new Spark compares to the original. So, long story short, they sound very similar to one another. In fact, there's only going to be two major differences. Number one, the treble on the new Spark has been improved. It's more extended, it's more airy. I would say it's even more refined sounding. And then you have the dynamic output, which is going to be notably stronger. Otherwise, they have the same general sound. Now, is it worth upgrading from the original Spark to the Spark II? Well, I would say that depends. If you own the Spark right now and you like it and you're not really interested in the ultimate expression of that sound, keep it and call it a day. However, if you love the Spark and you want an even better version of that general sound, I would definitely consider moving in that direction. Anyways, that's going to be my take on that subject, and now it's time to talk about how it sounds. Okay, so when I first sat down and listened to the Spark II, I noticed three things pretty much right away. Number one, it has a very mid-range focused presentation, which I think is a good thing because the mid-range on the Spark II is so good. Something I'll get to in just a moment. Next, I couldn't help but notice the tone, the overall purity of the sound, and the layering within the soundstage, all of which I think is unusually good for the money. But then lastly, I couldn't help but notice that the Spark II only really sounds alive when you pair it up to speakers that are either easy to drive, or number two, you use it in a desktop environment where the speakers are only maybe a couple feet at most from your ears. More on that later. But for now, let's just focus on the overall sound characteristics of the Spark II, starting with its overall character. Of course, as with every hi-fi component, it definitely has a character, and I would say that it airs slightly towards the laid-back and dark side of neutral. Let me explain what I mean. So we have this line, and on one end of the line we have forward and aggressive sounding components that project sound in a very in-your-face kind of way. In the middle we have absolute neutrality, no coloration at all. And then on the opposite end we have very rolled off, laid back, warm sounding speakers that roll off the treble, boost the mid-range, and so on and so forth. So the Spark on that line resides ever so slightly towards the laid back and warm side of neutral. But what's so interesting about the Spark is that there's an anomaly. Did I say that right? Anomaly? Whatever. There is a deviation from that character in the lower treble and upper mid-range, where there's going to be some prominence there. And the net result of that is an interesting character because on one hand it has a very approachable sound. It's forgiving of poorly recorded material, at least a little bit. But then it has this liveliness to the sound as well. And ultimately, it gives you this good resolution without being overbearing, but it's not so friendly sounding that it homogenizes the listening experience. It's a really good balance. So let's go into a little bit more detail, starting with the treble. So obviously, even though the mid-range is the star of the show on the Spark II, the treble is notably improved over the original Spark, because one of my criticisms with the original Spark is that the treble is where you knew you were listening to a budget component. It was just a little rough, a little gritty, a little unrefined, whereas the Spark II is a lot more extended, it's more airy sounding, it's more refined, it's just straight up more realistic and honest. And I think the treble balance is what a lot of people want for something at this price point. It's not overbearing in any way. There's a little bit of energy into lower treble, but it's still something that's revealing while at the same time not brutalizing less than perfect recordings. And if anything, I think the tone of it is pretty good. Next, let's move on to the mid-range. So obviously the mid-range is where I think the Spark is really special. And it's difficult to describe how, because most of the time when somebody goes on about the mid-range, especially a reviewer, it's because there's this warmth there's this body to the sound. And with the Spark II, it's actually more close to neutral than anything else. It's just there's a tonal accuracy there that's just unusually good for something at this price. In fact, even at $1,000, this would still be something special, because when you listen to it, instruments take on this almost natural character. It doesn't sound like a typical budget hi-fi piece. It sounds more real, more resolute, more balanced. The mid-range doesn't sound overly thick. It doesn't sound too thin. It doesn't sound like it's muting any kind of information, at least with respect to something at its price point. And I think for people like me who are sensitive to good tone, you are going to love the mid-range. And plus, it has a good sense of energy to it. When you listen to vocals, it doesn't sound like this sense of scale and this immediacy in the mid-range would come from an integrated amp, let alone a Class AB integrated amp that's as small as it is. It's just really, really special. And then we have the bass. So inherently speaking, the bass is very quick, very tuneful, and it can actually have really good control, especially over speakers that use paper drivers. But here's where things get a little bit more complex. The bass that you experience out of the Spark II will hinge almost entirely on the speakers that you use. For example, if the speakers use light cone materials, the bass will be very quick, very tuneful, and it'll still be strong. But if you're pairing it up to speakers that are difficult to drive and needs a lot of horsepower to move thicker cone materials, then it's going to sound quick, yes, tuneful, yes, but not very strong. So it just depends. Dynamic output, on a macro scale, it won't deliver those big bombastic passages like a more powerful amplifier will, but it's actually surprising given its size. But the real trick here is going to be the micro dynamics. It's going to be those subtle nuances when somebody is strumming along a guitar and they change the amount of force that they put behind each strum, whatever. So you hear that with exceptional clarity over a lot of other products in the same price range. The noise floor is impressively low, which of course lends itself well to products like higher end Tecton speakers, Klipsch Heritage speakers, or of course anybody who plans on using it in a near field environment where the drivers are only literally a foot or two away from your ears. All in all, it's a very good performer if you can accommodate it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to things you can do to accommodate the speaker and also bluntly talk about what you shouldn't do with it. Then I'm going to go over to caveats, and then we're going to wrap this up. Okay, most of you will notice a change in the lighting, and that's because I decided to refilm this part of the review. Truth be told, I just rambled for too long during my original take. So here's the bottom line. The Vista Audio Spark II is capable of great performance for the money, but only when you accommodate it appropriately. So in this section, I'm going to explain exactly what I mean. So let's start off by going over what works well with the Spark II. So, as in the case with any low power amplifier, it tends to pair up best to speakers that are easy to drive. So let's lay down a couple guidelines. I think a good starting point would be a speaker that has a power sensitivity rating of 90 dB or higher. And you also want a speaker that has an impedance load between 6 to 8 ohms nominal. Yes, it can dip down lower, but that's going to be the target you want to stick with. And the reason being is it's just easier for the amplifier to drive. Now, some other things that I noticed is that it also pairs up best with speakers that use light cone materials, for example, a paper material. So I would say that it would pair up well with Tecton design products, pretty much the whole portfolio, pretty much anything from Klipsch, especially the Klipsch Heritage line, and it also forms a great match with Triangle. In fact, the best I've ever heard the Triangle Bro 3 for anything under $1,000 is with the Spark version 2. While the bass is compromised in terms of raw output, the tonal accuracy and just the overall purity of the mid-range and the top end, you almost have to hear it in order to really and truly take it in, because it truly gives you a taste of what high-end audio is all about. And for what? Under $1,000. It's just absolutely crazy. So now let's talk about what does not work well with the Spark II. So as you can imagine, it's pretty much any speaker that requires a lot of power. A good example would be ELAC. Most of their speakers respond well to good power, and when you pair them up to something like a Spark II, what happens is that the sound becomes enclosed and trapped. That somewhat lively top end goes away, strong bass, that goes away. You're left with good mid-range, but that's all you really have. So it's not really a good match. The Bacard Audio S400 is another example of a product that likes this power, and it just doesn't sound very good with the Spark II. Now the S300 is actually pretty acceptable. So anything that requires a lot of power, just stay away from it, or anything that's below the specifications that I gave to you earlier, just stay away unless, and here's the exception to the rule, if you plan on using the Spark in a desktop environment where the speakers are only literally a foot or two away from your ears. In that environment, the caveats of having a low power amplifier are pretty much mitigated, which means you can pick pretty much anything you want that you think will sound good in that environment in terms of speakers. For example, when I first listened to it, I evaluated it with the P3 ESR from Harbeth, which is not a very easy speaker to drive, but in that environment, it sounded great. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on the situation. So now let's go over just a few more caveats. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time here because, quite frankly, I already covered the main and most important caveat already, which is the Spark II is going to have a limited appeal due to its limited ability to drive a wide variety of loudspeakers, particularly to loud volumes. So next, let's go over another obvious caveat, which is it doesn't come with any features to speak of to include a remote or a pre-out. If you want to use a subwoofer, you're going to have to go high pass, which honestly is probably the best way to use a subwoofer in a 2-channel system anyways, but still, I realize not everybody's going to have that option. That may be a deal breaker, and if so, there's plenty of other options out there. So now let's move on to the only criticism that I truly have for the Spark II that I didn't already mention, which is the fact that even though there are so many lights on this integrated amplifier now, it's missing a light in what I feel is the most important spot, which is the volume control. There's not even paint on there to indicate where the volume is, which means if you're in a dimly lit room, it can be difficult to spot. And if you're in a completely dark room, I mean, forget it. You're just going to have to feel around and adjust by ear. To me, it's not a big deal. It's definitely not a deal killer, but it seems like something of an oversight. But beyond that, I think this is one heck of a good integrated amp. And that leads me to my final thoughts. Okay, so let's just be straight up. Is the Spark II an integrated amplifier that I can recommend to most of you? No, probably not. But if you're somebody who's looking for a killer desktop solution, or let's just say you're in a small room and you're more about quality over quantity, you just want really good sound and you don't plan on jamming out all the time, then the Spark II gets my highest recommendation for anybody who's looking for a solution under $500. And the fact that it's designed and made in Serbia, with most of the components being either made in Japan, the US, or Europe, I think it offers an incredible value for those of you who can accommodate it properly. Anyways, that's going to be my take on the Spark II. I think it's a great evolution over the original, and I really like it. Stick around if you're interested in a comparison. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace. Okay, so before I wrap up this video for good, I have one little section to cover, and that is how the Vista Audio Spark II compares to the Iota VX SA3. And what makes this so interesting is that the SA3 has been my go-to recommendation now for a while when it comes to anybody who's looking for a solution in and around this price point. So now the big question is, can the Spark II dethrone the SA3? We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, let's go over some generic, boring specifications. So the Vista Audio Spark is a purist integrated amplifier with literally no features except for 2 analog inputs. It retails for $389. It's designed and made in Serbia. It outputs 20 watts per channel into 8 ohms, and it's a consumer direct product, meaning that many of you who buy it will be purchasing it directly from Serbia. However, they will have some support in countries like the United States and in Vietnam, and I'm sure that list will expand as time moves forward. Now, beneath that, we have the Iota VX SA3 integrated amplifier, which is a full feature piece. It comes with a built-in DAC, built-in phono stage, the ability to stream to it with the addition of a dongle, a pre-out, tone controls, a remote control, the works. It also outputs 45 watts per channel into 8 ohms, literally doubling the power of the Spark. It's designed in the UK, manufactured in China, and it too is a consumer direct product. So when you purchase it, it'll come directly from the UK. So the big question is, how do they stack up to each other in terms of performance? Well, it's interesting. Both units actually have a sound that I would describe as being slightly laid back, slightly along the warm side of neutral. Yet despite that, when you listen to them, there's clear differences. So first, I gotta make it clear that the SA3 is by far the more versatile piece. It has twice the power, and you can hear that. It can pair up better to a much wider variety of speakers, and because of the features that it has, it's still going to be my go-to recommendation for most people because this is the kind of solution that most people are looking for. However, when you have efficient speakers, this is where I think in terms of sound quality, the Spark II pulls ahead. For example, the treble. Even though the treble on both products are not offensive and actually fairly refined for the money, the Spark II has treble that's a little bit more lively, it's a little bit more resolute, it's definitely more refined, which is surprising given how it costs even less money. And overall, I would say that it's just more realistic sounding than what you get with the SA3. And when it comes to the mid-range, no comparison there whatsoever. Again, you have to be running power-sensitive speakers, but in that scenario, what you're going to get is something that's more tonally accurate, even better balanced than the SA3. There's going to be just a little bit of liveliness in that upper mid-range and treble, which will help to project sound in a more forward and immediate way. And I think it's something that most people are going to prefer. The bass, on the other hand, it's going to be tighter, and I think it's going to be more tonally correct through the Spark, but on many loudspeakers, it's just going to be flat out fuller sounding through the SA3, and that's where that additional power definitely comes in handy. And it's part of the reason why I feel the SA3 is going to be more to people's taste, because there's more drive to the sound, more cojones to it, a little bit more scale and dynamic range. So when it comes to imaging, they're both very similar. I think the Spark II does a better job of allowing speakers to have a rock center focus in the middle of the soundstage, but otherwise they're very similar. But the problem with the Spark is that it can only showcase these strengths over the SA3 when you pair it up to efficient speakers or you're using it in a desktop environment, either or, because when you pair it up to an average sensitivity speaker of say 88, 84 dB as a 4-ohm load, it's going to lose a lot of that. It's going to sound closed in. It's going to sound not quite one note, but it's not going to have a lot of dynamic range to it or a lot of bass to it. It'll be mostly mid-range with just a little bit of treble. So it's really going to depend on how you use the Spark. That's going to hinge on whether or not you prefer it over something like the SA3. But both of them are very, very good for the money and are products that I will continue to recommend people as I feel their situation fits. So anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on the Vista Audio Spark version 2. So thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.